Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of All Folked Up. This is the show where I talk about folk music and history and how they connect to each other, and if you haven't seen the other episodes of this series yet, you should go check them out on my channel below. Today we're going to be talking about the American folk music revival of the 1960s. A lot of you are probably familiar with this. I know I grew up listening to music from this era. I know a lot of other people who did as well. This genre of music is really specific to the 1960s, although it does have some history in the 50s and it extended a little bit into the 1970s as well. The folk music of the 1960s was characterized by a strong sense of activism and a desire for social change, and these themes are reflected pretty clearly in a lot of the original music of this era. Now, in the early 20th century, American folk music was really just a term used by scholars to describe traditional music, but some labor unions in the 1910s started to use that traditional music to band together their supporters. And as they moved into the 1930s and 40s, the Communist Party began to target trade unions, and they used folk music to reach out to the common people and attract them to their cause. But McCarthyism, which was very, very anti-communist, came about in the 1950s, and so folk music was driven underground as a result of that. However, by the time the 1960s rolled around, the Red Scare was pretty much over, and folk music artists started to come out of the woodwork. Some say the folk revival began with the release of the Kingston Trio's song Tom Dooley, which became a #1 hit. When these folk songs returned, they still carried strong messages of the power of the common people. The professional style of the Kingston Trio and other artists like them, like the Limelighters and the Brothers Four, made their bands really easy to market, especially to young people. In the early 1960s, albums were released by both Bob Dylan and Joan Baez, two people who became pretty much the faces of the 1960s folk music revival. Joan Baez has a really strong operatic-sounding voice, and so she gave new life to old traditional ballads. On the other hand, Bob Dylan was a grittier artist, and he sang more original and American folk music. His music was influenced a whole lot by political protest. Another famous artist named Pete Seeger, who had performed folk music throughout the 30s and 40s, returned post-McCarthy era with a vengeance. His music combined old American folk, children's songs, civil rights music, spirituals, and folk songs from all over the place. A lot of the original music coming out of this time period was very politically charged. It was pro-civil rights movement and anti-Vietnam War. This is a really great example of how historical context directly influences folk music. These people were singing about things that mattered to them, like social justice. They sang about war and hypocrisy that they saw in politics. A lot of the times these were young people, which made this style of folk music really, really unique. And funny enough, it seemed to work. The Vietnam War protests are widely remembered today, and one could say that they inspire generations of young activists even today. Something really interesting about this genre of music is that a lot of the times these young artists were inspired by the more traditional ballads that came before them. It's kind of interesting to think about how all folk music is sort of connected, no matter what time period it was sung in or who was singing it. Anyway, that's it for this episode of All Folked Up. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you again real soon. Bye-bye.